Hello, my name is LoGsounds. Today is going to be another example of a Patreon lesson. This lesson is from a more casual series that I do called Stuff I'm Practicing, where I pretty much just put a camera in front of me and talk about whatever I'm currently practicing or whatever's currently on my mind. This series is also available to all patrons of any tier and is usually put out once a week. This particular lesson is about left-hand positioning on the fretboard in a way that promotes finger independence as well as comfort. Hopefully you enjoy it, and I'll see you in the next one. What's happening, everyone? Welcome to another edition of Stuff I'm Practicing. Today we're going to be talking about technique, in particular kind of getting stronger with your pinky, or really maybe ring or pinky, kind of the weaker fingers. There's actually a lot that goes into this that I think isn't talked about that much, or maybe it is, but usually whenever I talk to people and they have issues with pinky or ring finger, their solutions usually miss one of the most important things when it comes to that, and that really has to do with like positioning of your hand, less of like strengthening the pinky or strengthening the ring finger. It really has a lot to do with how your hand is just literally sitting on the guitar, because that will change a lot. Now, because we're talking about technique is an intensely like personal thing, meaning it's going to be wildly different depending on the person, right? Because everyone kind of has different sized hands, different sized palms, different length fingers, different width fingers, different length thumb. All of that stuff drastically changes how all of this stuff will be played. So you do have to kind of mess around with it yourself, figure out where you stand. But the main thing I want to talk about really has to do with positioning. So most people, when they pick up the guitar and they play like in the very beginning, what they'll often do is they'll sit the guitar in their hand like this, right? Why would they do that? Because the neck is sitting in like between the palm, or between the thumb and the pointer finger, in this nice kind of comfortable little divot area, and their hand is usually angled like this. Why is that? Because the human hand generally in its resting position, if I just kind of rest my hand like this and go like that, notice my hand, the angle is this way. My hand is not pointing like straight up. Most people, this is not their resting position, hand pointing straight up. I have to force my hand to do that. You can see my hand's relaxed, now I'm forcing it. My hand's relaxed, now I'm forcing it. So if my hand's natural position is to angle like this, if we put the guitar in my hand, notice the angle of my hand, it's this way, right? A lot of people will naturally play like this because it's very comfortable for your hand. It feels natural. But the problem with this is your fingers are unbalanced or uneven in how they are all contacting the fretboard. So you can see my pointer finger right here is like super curled up like this when I'm naturally on it, but then my pinky is completely extended, right? They're completely different as we move down. The fingers on this side are more curled, like my pointer and middle finger, but then as I get to the right side, my fingers are more straight. Now, of course, if you have bigger hands, like my hands aren't super big, but if you have bigger hands, then you might find a more even distribution of like the curling. Maybe all your fingers can curl naturally. But for me, and I would say most people, this is usually what would happen, right? And what happens here is you have fingers that just don't feel the same. And when you have fingers that are in a different position and they don't feel the same, you're going to favor some fingers over others, right? Like the pointer finger and middle finger probably feel really comfortable to play right here because you have that kind of natural angle that you can kind of put force down on the string. But the pinky probably feels really awkward because it's completely outstretched over here, which is the big problem when people first start playing, especially leads. Most people position their hand like this because it's comfortable. It fits naturally with the natural like angle of the hand, the resting angle of the hand, and the neck just feels comfortable. So that's why a lot of people will start to play like this, right? Notice my hand. I'm kind of, the neck is in my, kind of in this little dip of my thumb into my pointer finger. All my fingers are curled or kind of angled this way. My thumb is grabbing the neck like this, which is perfect for certain genres where you want more control. Like if I'm trying to do a bend, I'm pretty much always going to do that. If I want like a very like subtle vibrato, this position is really nice for that because I feel like I have more control over the string. But what you have less control over is the independence of the fingers. So the first thing you want to do if you want to get comfortable with this is you need to modify either the angle of the guitar neck or your hand so that your fingers all have an evenly like angled distribution. Like they're all balanced in the same way. Notice if I just simply drop my hand, thumb now not on the neck, I can drop my hand, maybe tilt the neck up just a little bit so that it matches the angle of my hand. right? So if my guitar neck was like this, it would be really difficult for me to play like this because now I'm forcing my hand into this straight up position, which just doesn't feel right. So often angling the neck will allow you to maintain that natural tilt that your hand has while still keeping your fingers relatively straight. So if you notice me playing, my neck is pretty tilted, right? This is my neck pretty much like parallel to the ground. I don't play like that. I play like this. Like it's pretty elevated so that my hand can naturally fit. But look what happens to my fingers now. They're all straight, right? They're not like this. They're not angled. They're not like uneven in how they're being positioned on the fretboard. They're all straight on the fretboard. And notice also, it's very easy for me to have a really clean one finger per fret stretch. This is very comfortable for me, right? I have no problems regardless of where I am on the fretboard. Now, most people, if you're not used to this, what they'll often do is play like this, right? So this is kind of the second thing that is sort of a problem. You put your hands naturally on the fretboard like this. Now, notice what I have. I do not have a 4-fret stretch. My pointer finger's here, my pinky's here. That's only 2 frets away, or I should say maybe 3 frets away, or whatever, whole step away. So what you're doing when you play like this, even though it's comfortable, you are not training your fingers to be naturally independent independent between each finger. When they are in contact with each other, they're almost like relying on each other for extra strength or kind of reference. So what you need to immediately start doing is just placing your hand on the fretboard like this. So your fingers are not touching each other. And you have a clean 4-fret stretch. Pointer finger here, middle, ring, pinky. Now, depending on the size of your hand, this is going to be easier for some people, but you absolutely want to have this. Because if your hand is like this, then your pinky feels like it has its own place to live. This fret. The ring finger has this fret to live on. Middle finger, pointer finger. Everyone kind of has its own place. And if you practice like that and think like that, that's how your hand will naturally position itself, okay? So, yeah, notice the angle of my hand. All my fingers are more or less pointing straight up. Of course, it's not going to 100% be like this. You might have a little bit of angle depending on what you're doing, but that's what you want to do. You do not want to have them super angled where they're all completely different shape as you put them on the fretboard. You also don't want them touching each other, right? Touching each other is the way that you do not learn finger independence. You have to keep them stretched out like this. That's why when people play bar chords, they often try to do something like this in the beginning, right? They want their fingers kind of touching each other because when they're focused like this, you kind of can grip a little bit better, making that bar chord a little cleaner. But in reality, to really build finger independence, you want to be able to play a bar chord without really any other finger heavily touching another one, right? That's the same exact thing we're talking about here. So if you're playing a lead, I'm just going to play like a simple, like, just these 3 notes, right? If I play like this, naturally, I might, what's comfortable is this. Right, because I have pointer, middle, ring, that feels natural. If I try to use pinky, my pinky feels super debilitated right now because it's got this like super outstretched feeling. It just doesn't feel like I have control over it. But then, of course, if I straighten my hand, now it feels like I have a lot more control over the pinky because everything is of an even angle. So that's super important. And how am I getting this angle? Like I mentioned, tilting the neck, but I'm also, this is kind of the most important part, adjusting my thumb. Oftentimes when people play, they like to grab the neck, which is really nice for certain things. Anything that has to do with string control, bending, maybe sliding vibrato, if you're ever doing a rake like I'm doing right there, which is when you strum every string but mute everything except for the one string you're going for. Like the thumb is really nice for that. Just have more control. But when you want this 4-fret stretch, the thumb cannot be like this. You have to practice with the thumb down. I always say, if I'm teaching someone, I always say you want to play to the point where you, the viewer, cannot see my thumb. Right? My thumb is here. You can kind of see where it is. Also, not only is it low, it's kind of like that low. Depending on what I'm doing, it might be here or there, depending on what the lick is. But also where kind of horizontally it lays is super important. The most important thing you want to do is pretty much have, and again, this is going to change depending on the person, you want the thumb to be across from like the mid section of your fingers. So if I'm playing, let's say here's like the stretch that I have, right? Notice my thumb is pretty much right in the middle of the outer fingers, right? It's in the middle of this stretch. I think this is called, I feel like this is called like a fulcrum or something like that, where you're kind of like got this like middle pressure point that evens out the pressure between your fingers. If my thumb was back here, my pointer finger would feel more pressured because I've got that thumb backing it up, but the pinky would feel less. So it'd be harder to use the pinky. And then same thing if my thumb is like really far forward over here, that kind of offsets the pressure back here on my pinky, even though there is uses for that, which I'll show you in a second. So if I'm doing something like this, like a simple 4-fret stretch, my thumb is generally going to be here, right? So if I'm going, right, and then notice what I did right there. I don't know if you caught that. I'm playing something like this. Thumb is in the back. And then as I came down, planned on doing like a little vibrato, my thumb snuck up and I went back into that standard, almost like lazy position. Because I knew I wanted to do that and I knew it was more comfortable. So there's a little tiny like shift that's happening there. Right, so notice as I start to go into other fingers, my positioning changes. So if I'm playing, I'm constantly shifting my hand depending on what I'm doing, right? And a lot of this, what this does is it helps all the fingers feel more even. Feels like you have more control over each individual one. Again, having the thumb low across from the midpoint of your fingers and having every finger stretched out, living on its own fret. Now watch this. If I try to do a bigger stretch, this is another important thing. Watch what my thumb does when I do a bigger stretch. Let's say I want to go for this, right? So now I have... that's like a fourth distance, 1, 2, 3, 4. Look at where my thumb is now. So my thumb has moved to accommodate the new midpoint of my hand. If it's back here, see where my thumb is now? My thumb is here because this is essentially the midpoint, right? Like in between these two. But if I'm doing a bigger stretch, I can't keep my thumb here. My thumb has to move to accommodate the new midpoint. The midpoint is now like here. It's not back here where my thumb originally was. So depending on the stretch that you have, you want that thumb to modify. You want that thumb to move. Honestly, if you're doing this, that's probably naturally going to happen for you. Your thumb will probably naturally move as you try bigger stretches. But if it's not moving, you have to make that accommodation because that's how you keep things even, right? The whole point is you have fingers pushing this way and the thumb pushing the other way, and you want that pressure between the two to be even. If the thumb is offset too far in one direction, the pressure won't be even around and it will feel odd, right? So it's really important that you have that thumb always backing up your fingers depending on what you're doing, okay? That's a super important thing. Now, in regards to actually strengthening the pinky, the best thing you could do is honestly just use it a lot, right? Just maybe do something like this, like a simple pull-off pointer to pinky to pointer. That, I mean, I don't know. I don't find too much use out of that. I personally just like to play phrases that have the pinky, but if you want to just like brute force the strength of the pinky, just try to bring it up every day. Something like that is really good. This is a classic kind of exercise. I'm just going pinky, pull off, ring, pinky, ring, pull off. Notice though how the positioning of my hand is. My thumb is back here in the midpoint. I'm not like this, right? My thumb is here so that each finger is pointing straight up as much as it normally would be. And all the fingers are not, you know, they're kind of hanging out by themselves. They're not touching either finger. Finish that look a little bit better. There's another thing that is very important as well, depending on what the part is. One thing that could kind of help you is instead of keeping your fingers always like this, sometimes I notice if I'm doing a pinky intensive passage and I need my pinky to be more curled or have more like upward like dominance over the string, because right now if I try to play like this right here with this exact position, watch this, you can kind of see my pinky. I'm gonna reach for the G string. See, my pinky's kind of straight right now. It's kind of, my pinky's also not terribly long. It's kind of straight, and when it's straight like that, I don't have that much control over it. If it's curled like this, I have more control. So watch what I'm gonna do. If I'm gonna reach for this G string, instead of just keeping the position and just reaching with my pinky, I'm actually going to turn my wrist this way, allowing my pinky to have more room to kind of curl naturally. So if I'm doing this move, see that little twist of my wrist? Instead of going just like this and just reaching with the pinky, I'm going to twist my wrist a little bit so that my pinky is now like above the string, or kind of like further up than the rest of your hands. It's almost like the opposite of this. If I play like this and my wrist is turned this way, my pointer finger is kind of the dominant finger and everything else is sort of outstretched. But if I turn my wrist this way, now it's the opposite. My pinky is now the dominant finger and everything else has to accommodate. So if I'm doing something like this, you see my wrist is like twisted a little bit. That allows my pinky just to have a little bit more kind of free motion to curve or curl naturally when it's on top of the string. And it depends on what I'm doing. Like this stretch, obviously I can't really turn because then my pointer finger wouldn't be able to grab. But it really just depends on what you're playing. But that's another thing that can really help depending on what you're doing. So yeah, the main thing, honestly, when it comes to building your finger independence, especially the pinky, a weaker finger, is to first, you have to make sure that this 4-fret stretch is comfortable. You can't always be in the habit of playing with your fingers like touching each other like this, or kind of crammed like that. If this is your natural resting position on the fretboard, you need to, I don't want to say you need to stop it, but you kind of do, and you need to make sure that this is the natural resting position where your fingers are stretched out. This is going to be harder for some people, but it's something you always want to do, and it's just kind of training your hand to kind of open up like that. And remember, this on the guitar, this might feel like a stretch if you're not used to it, but if I pull my hand away, this is what it looks like. That's all it is. Like, I think everyone can handle a normal outstretched hand like that. It's not that crazy, right? So all we're doing is we're just taking that and putting it on the fretboard. So really important that you train yourself to do this. You don't want to be too relaxed. Like, if I'm playing like this, obviously great for certain things, but not for practicing pinky stuff. You want to be able to have that natural stretch on your hand and then experiment with whatever patterns you want, like running, pentatonic or whatever, but don't be afraid also to go for these big stretches, right? A lot of people in the beginning are kind of afraid of larger stretches like this. Just start doing them. Like, it's going to be harder depending on the size of your hand, but figure out what it takes for you to get these stretches. If that means tilt the neck like super aggressively, do that. If that means move the thumb even lower to increase that stretch, always keeping that middle kind of balance point of the thumb, do that. Whatever you need to do. If it's really hard to do this stretch, is like 2 whole steps. If it's really hard to do this stretch, start here and slowly kind of move your way back. But this stretch is super valuable because it focuses on the pinky independence, right? Because I'm doing pointer, middle, pinky. Pinky is hanging out by himself over here, or by itself over here. It kind of has to do all the work, in of itself. So that this stretch is really valuable for that. So you can practice like just doing simple stuff like this. I'm kind of like doing a little whole step, next string, 2 whole steps, next string to stay within the key. This is like 7, 1, 2, if that's my root. Up to the B string, same thing, just kind of doing that. Like, I don't want to get too much into specific exercises because I don't really think that that's a great idea for me to just show you exercises. The reality is you have to create the exercises yourself because only you know what your true strengths and weaknesses are. So an exercise for me that's really great for me maybe works for me, but it doesn't really work for you. So you really have to figure out this stuff yourself. But those classic, like, standard things of positioning, making sure your fingers aren't clumped together, making sure your fingers aren't angled like this, making sure the thumb is down, always keeping that thumb in like the balance point. So if you do a bigger stretch, the thumb has to change depending on where you're going. All of that stuff is super valuable. And just being able to put your hands on the fretboard, have a 4-fret stretch that's comfortable, and it doesn't feel like you're cramping or your fingers are being stretched too far apart. This needs to be comfortable regardless of position that you're in. That will give you a huge boost into strengthening your pinky, and you'll be on your way when you do that. And again, keep in mind tilting of the wrist depending on what you want to do. Of course, always try to play on the fingertips as much as possible. My pinky, I'm usually never on the fingertip, but it's fine with me. I don't really need to do that too much because the way I play generally works for me, at least. Think about all that stuff. It's really just about finger independence. If you practice finger independence, the strength of each finger will naturally happen over time. Hopefully this stuff makes sense. See you in the next one.